This podcast is made possible with support from Audix, makers of professional vocal, studio, and instrument microphones and headphones. Performance is everything. Learn more at audixusa.com.
Hey, it's Larry Crane. Welcome to the Tape Op Podcast. Fleet Foxes recently released their fourth album, Sure, a sprawling and at times cinematic work that began as a solo record for the band's singer and principal songwriter, Robin Pecknold. Written and recorded in several locations around the globe, Robin and engineer Beatriz Artola, working with outside musicians and band members, have created the band's most mature and engaging work to date. Geoff Stanfield caught up with Robin from their respective homes in Seattle and Los Angeles to talk about the process of recording the album and chat about some of their favorite tracks. Enjoy.
How are you, man?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I wanted to focus our conversation around the production and really just sort of the intent around making this record. So I'll just jump in and say, how did you approach making this record, and how is it different than the records that you'd previously done?
The approach was, similar in certain ways. I feel like doing this long enough, I kind of got into the groove of, understanding what each phase of the process would be, and kind of being really directed about, okay, I'm going to go to Portugal for a few weeks and try and write songs there, and get into that kind of fish out of water mindset that sometimes cool songs come out of. Or I'm going to go to this weird place and try and write some other songs. And so I had about a year of kind of writing songs that way, and it was right at the tail end of touring the last album. And a lot of the approach was informed by that tour, because the previous album, there hadn't been a tour for a few years before that. So it was more of a kind of a studio thing, or there was no kind of context of performance that I was thinking about. And then being back on tour and like enjoying it a lot. And then also kind of noticing that it took a minute to get back up to speed with, performing and giving building those muscles back. That experience definitely informed these songs. I was like, okay, I was kind of thinking about songs that would be really fun to play live more so when writing these songs, which is ironic that now it comes out and there's no opportunities to tour for a while. But another aspect of it was, it was the fourth album. I really wanted to kind of go for it as much as I could and take everything. It was a little bit more about kind of, folding in everything I've learned over the last 12 years or even 15 or 20 years of trying to write songs, and just kind of synthesize that all and kind of bring it all into balance, or, employ it all in a new way, and less about like, being really experimental, or being kind of willfully obtuse, or being, it was more about integration than it was kind of, continuing to then kind of forsaking the past, or paying too much fealty to it, or whatever.
Yeah, but you talked about it being having the intent being like really about songs that you'd like to play live, but you made this record without the other members of the existing Fleet Foxes. Did this come out of a solo record, or did this come out of you just really wanting to have a singular focus and see it to its logical conclusion?
Yeah, I guess songs that felt good to play live was less about having them be performed live and more about while recording them, and more about having really consistent or solid grooves behind them, which is something that has been lacking at times on past Fleet Foxes albums. And process-wise, it wasn't that different this time versus the other times. It's usually like, it's always been my songs and my lyrics, and I'm recording most of the instruments and usually most of the vocals. and then they're, bringing people in kind of once the vision is really clear, bringing people in to kind of augment that. So the process wasn't different, but it was just a wider field of collaborators and, contributors on this album. And back to kind of, that was also, I thought, because I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to make, an expensive album again. And I thought I might as well just go for it this time, rather than wait, or, because who knows what the future holds. And it was definitely, the process was influenced by and changed by the pandemic. And I had to kind of, figure out how I was going to finish it and on what timeline. And that was definitely a factor.
So you worked with Beatriz Artola on this record, and I was curious about how you guys worked together, and how was that different than past producer collaborations with somebody like Phil Ek?
Yeah, on the previous album, Crack Up, it was me and my friend Sky, and that was a good kind of, it's always good to have somebody to kind of, be bouncing ideas off of, and kind of, letting an album live kind of in the space between two people sometimes feels good, and Phil Ek was definitely that person on Helplessness Blues, more so than on the first Three Foxes album, which was kind of like piecemeal, sometimes recording in my parents' basement and sometimes doing 2 days at a studio because that's what we could afford, and just kind of like scraping something together over the course of a year with very little resources. So with Beatrice, I was excited to work with someone new and someone that I had a good working relationship with, from a different context. I felt strong enough in like what I wanted to make that it wasn't necessarily like, I was more interested in her as a person and her technical abilities than I was in like maybe past records she'd made or something. Whereas, with someone like Phil, it's like, oh, he made the, Built to Spill albums, and it's like legend, and he's also an awesome guy, but that wasn't the case with Beatrice. It was just like, she's a great person, great discography, but just like a great person. And then we worked really well together. There was never kind of I think when we were recording the vocals, I asked her to give a little more input in terms of when a take was good enough, because I can lose focus on that kind of thing when recording vocals. But before that, it was really, she wasn't like, you got to get that bass take again, or, one more time, it wasn't that kind of producer role. It was more like, something was done when it would just kind of felt it in the air when something was done, rather than it being stated explicitly. And even, I think for me, the main thing I would look, if she was kind of bobbing her head along to something, that I knew that it was working, and so that was kind of the like unspoken litmus test or something.
It's often overlooked, the value of the hang and the people in the room.
Oh, totally. And I mean, with Beatrice, it was, I was lucky that she does have like all the technical ability in the world, and but yeah, it was more that, we were able to work day in and day out, 12-hour, 16-hour days sometimes, and there was no kind of like social exhaustion, which can happen sometimes if there are too many cooks in the kitchen, or it's like a relationship isn't vibing right, and then that ultimately just becomes like an impediment to, can be at times an impediment to making progress and making the work you want to make and being like productive, and I know there are stories about, bands that hate each other making these great albums, and that becomes part of the mythology of certain things. But that's also just like how much, you don't want a toxic environment. I don't think that's like necessarily a good thing at all.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance or the effect of the place on lyrics, and just general inspiration?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think touring for 2 years, I think I was for Crack Up, it took me a little while. I was, that feeling of like loving traveling, but then only getting to see a place for a day. I was into the idea of then making an album that had a travel element. And I had, been able to, from the tour, had this then luxurious budget, that I wouldn't have had otherwise, to kind of make that dream come true. I think this was definitely like the most gratuitous in terms of, yeah, let's just fly to France for 2 weeks. But that was also because it was just me and Beatrice working, and it was just cheaper. If you're working in a really small team, you can do things like that, and it's a little bit, makes more sense than trying to fly 10 people somewhere, and that would just be too expensive. And so back to that thing of just like really wanting to go for it this time, and just kind of make the dream album that I'd always envisioned, and then kind of have the dream experience, which was like, yeah, go to this cool studio in France, or go to Vox in LA, all these dream studios that I had on the list, I was really thinking about it like, I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to do this again, and might as well just go for it. And I think like it really comes back to, in the future, I'll, probably, having scratched that itch, I don't feel the need to do that again necessarily. But it is definitely in my experience, definitely true that the more unfamiliar you are with a circumstance, the more kind of fresh ideas you might find coming to you,
Travel on its own is great, and you can gather inspiration, but you're sort of packing it away, as opposed to what it sounded like you did was you were kind of working during these travels and gathering bits of things and writing, and then being able to, put that stuff in a fixed medium, and record it.
Yeah. I mean, they're different, it was funny actually being able to work at Aaron's place as a tourist, basically, going to his studio for 2 weeks, because he built that place from the ground up. And he's much more of a producer and a kind of making the donuts day in and day out kind of musician. And I have this kind of, a little bit experiential way of approaching it, where there's a kind of like narrative to where all the studios are going to be, and putting that together. And I always thought that building my own studio, I'd feel like I'd lose inspiration at some point. But then Aaron's made like 3 Taylor Swift albums and a national album, and all kinds of people have been through that space that he built. So there's obviously like a ton of value in committing to that, and Field of Dream style. Like, if you build it, they will come.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the tone of your records, because although they're different and the writing is different, and you've developed as a writer and producer and musician in general, they're very classic sounding, and also there's a lot of reverb. You're not afraid of the wetness. And how do you manage to get the value of what you're writing about at the time through the sound?
Obviously, as simple as just like make something that sounds good to you. I've always gravitated towards like classic sounding stuff, or stuff that felt like warm or organic, or felt human, had that element of like technically very high quality, but very human, capturing very human things. I've also had a kind of I've liked kind of grand or transportative music that has kind of an ethereal or otherworldly quality, and been like taken by like that kind of approach. And I guess it just felt like the thing that was hardest to arrive at, or something, like the thing that would require the most kind of interesting work. I don't know. It's so hard talking about music sometimes.
Totally.
Because part of it's just it's as simple as just like, that's my taste. But why is that my taste? I think like on this record especially, it was kind of interesting because I was noticing just it was like reaching for the weirdest possible or the wrongest possible instrument to make the thing that was normal in the right way, that wasn't totally 100% like a throwback ripoff. It's maddening to talk about, and maddening to do, but it's just like that, trying to find that thing that's classic that doesn't feel like a pure 60s exotica ripoff or something, just that kind of like finding that weird balance, you know.
That's such an important thing that you just said, was like trying to fill or at least how I heard it, was try to fill a function with an instrument that was not necessarily the right instrument for the job,
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I'm at the point now where like, I think when I was younger, some of those records, I'd be so in love with them and they seem so hard to get to something like that it, it felt like the gauntlet was thrown down or something, like, oh, that's the gold standard. How did they make that? Got to learn all those techniques and like get it there, and I feel a little bit past that point now. And more it's just like, okay, how do I find the interesting thing that still feels like a song that has, some, but it's not like hero worship,
How do you look for the instruments and the tones that suit what you're trying to say to bring them to life via their frame,
My solution for that has actually been to write the lyrics last and approach them more like approach it really way more like I'm translating the music into words than it is that I'm done the other way around. That's been my approach so far. I've only recently, in the last month or so, started writing lyrics without music attached and kind of approaching it in a more straightforward lyric first way. But, it's really been the opposite. It's less like what instrument is suiting this word and more like what word, what line, what is this sound making me feel or think about, or what is it evoking? And then translating that into language,
Do you have melodies in mind when you're creating these arrangements and you're in the studio?
Well, the melodies are always there. I feel like I write melodies, melody is kind of something that's always like popping. Melodies are always coming into my mind for one reason or another, like just singing in the shower or just something while you're driving. Just like if my mind is idle, like melodies are coming to me and I'll write them down or record them into my phone. Or if have a period of like really intensively trying to write songs every day, I'll just have all those melodies kind of floating around. They'll eventually congeal into songs, and then, so the melodies are always there, and I'll have to kind of sing gibberish words along, with those melodies. And then some of those syllables stick and those, feel like they need to be there. And then really once the song is fully arranged and it has all the bells and whistles, like that's when I kind of am like, okay, what's this song feel like? And what is, cause it's really 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Like if you're sitting down to write a song, even without lyrics, you're still expressing something, some feeling or some state that you're in, that's coming through, like your whatever values you have are being encoded in that thing you're making. And so it's just one way of expressing it with sound or with music or with words, and so it's always worked to do the lyrics last for me.
Yeah, cool. Can we talk about a few of the tracks on the record?
Totally.
Yeah. A couple standouts for me, so maybe I'll just throw them out there, and then if you have some that you'd like to throw in the mix, please do. How about Jara? I love this tune.
A lot of the songs on this record, I wanted there to be a pretty simple underlying chord progression and then kind of mute it and just have it being expressed in a bunch of melodic stuff, and then, build it up from there and have like a lot of layers of cool counterpoint, even if the underlying chords are pretty simple, and that's a pretty simple like Mixolydian chord progression. And that was another one where, that riff is something I actually had for a few years, but it ended up pairing really well with this totally different melody. And used the Pet Sounds vibraphone on that one but it was acting as like a delay slapback for this 12-string guitar that they had at Vox. And it was, that was a good example of like, I had that song, I was building it, it was feeling cool, but it was feeling like that maybe this is like a little too like, birdsy 12-string. It's like it needed some modern element or something that wouldn't have been in one of those records. And so, that made me want to write the lyrics more from the perspective of now, after like a little bit feeling more present day, and then asking Mira O'Reilly to build this kind of, pocketed, really intricate vocal arrangement to kind of coexist with the more throwback elements. And once those things were there, it was like, okay, cool, this is like a real thing, and everything feels intentional, and it doesn't feel like it's trying to be something like a relic of something, but it's it's just in touch with some of those references.
How about Can I Believe You?
Yeah, that song was super fun to work on. That was like the, during the Crack Up tour, we were doing this, 2-hour show every night with like 3 breaks between songs or something, like a lot of really long instrumental passages. It was like pretty taxing mentally, and but it was really fun to do. But it was intense. So I would just, in the dressing room, I would just start writing that. I started writing that song. That's just kind of like a clear the air kind of breather from the kind of heavy, dusty, stuff we were doing on stage every night. And it was just like, kind of became this like fun, no rules kind of song, where it's like, cool, this is, kind of a like arena soul, like slightly weird. I thought it was kind of a funny song, tried a bunch of, it felt like a free space to try a bunch of things that wouldn't have felt comfortable trying in a song before, like a weird choir of voices that's like kids that send in submissions from Instagram, or like pitched conga drums, or scraping your shoes across the floor, or these kind of jarring big bright chords that come in, or it's just kind of this I don't know, like a get out of jail free card or something. I don't know.
I love the horns on this record. A couple of the tunes have some horns on them. Going to the Sun Road.
Yeah, man, that was like, because we'd worked with the Westerlies a little bit on Crack Up, but not enough, and then they joined us on tour for that album, and they were able to come up with these really beautiful arrangements for the old songs, and they did it. They'd have something ready in a day, and they're just an amazing group, that horn quartet. And so I knew that I wanted to work with them more on this album, and explore that more. And so they were actually the first, they came to Aaron's studio and just layered their arrangements onto basically demos. And so the horns were kind of there for the whole recording process. That's another thing that's a little backwards. Like those usually add those at the end or something, but those were there before I was recording around those the whole time. And on Going to the Sun Road, it was like, that's such a beautiful arrangement that Willem de Kock came up with for that song. And, that was lucky because, that arrangement was so cool and so lush. And so it made, it's kind of set the tone for what the rest of the song needed to sound like. And so, I had those horns in place and I was able to those are there, and then add these really intricate layers of minimal, kind of a pointillist harpsichord or something. And those were kind of informed by something complementary to that horn texture. And then, Tim Bernardes singing in Portuguese over that as well, and building the, actually ended up making that song like 2 minutes longer than it would have been to feature those horns and to feature Tim. And yeah, that was like a beautiful experience. And I'm really happy with that, how that song came out, to the point that I was like, should I even sing on this song, or like, should this even have a lyric? It should be an instrumental or something.
And then Cradling Mother and Cradling Woman, this one also has a little bit of a story because of the sample that you used in it.
That song was, so some of the stuff on, that's Brian Wilson's voice counting the song in, and he's, counting because it was like he was both counting the song in, but then he's also, giving the quarter note pattern or the 4/4 pattern. And then Beatrice's voice is singing the triplet pattern that's counter to it, and the whole song was built around this like 3/4, polyrhythm. And that was a song where I was like, I explored stuff a little bit like that on Crack Up, but I didn't feel like it was quite nailed in the way that it should be, like frequency spectrum wise or emotionally or something. So that was kind of like an unfinished business kind of song, like wanting to make the best version of that idea possible. And it was cool to have Brian, a sample of Brian Wilson counting it in, because he's such a obviously huge inspiration and a huge influence. And that song has by far the most layers of any Fleet Foxes song. And I really wanted it to be kind of as full spectrum as possible and just as dynamic as possible. And it felt like, I don't know, like Obi-Wan counting in
Yeah,
something, like it felt a little bit like, it's presumptuous, I think, to say it, but like master student teacher, student master or something, Brian's disembodied voice, and then the song that comes in is this very like, kind of dense, Baroque kind of like, I don't know, trying to impress the legend or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I mean, just even his presence of that on the track, I'm sure was just every single time you're reminded about that presence, and
Totally.
that's kind of cool, man. I mean, it's almost like you could do that and then not have it be in the final mixes for other things as a tool,
Totally. Yeah. He should count it. I'll just have him counting everything.
Yeah, let's open up that foot. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2,
One thing that I thought was really interesting on this, the way that you open the record, it's not you singing.
Yeah, I mean, that's related to the Brian thing, because I thought, like, lyrically, there are a lot of themes of, music as this kind of, this means of transmission of, and this kind of means of, musicians being our pantheon of gods or our legends, or, people like, David Berman or Richard Swift or Bill Withers or John Prine, people that have passed recently that we rightfully want to remember and carry their memories on. And that was a big part of what I was thinking about at the time, and that was coming out in the music, naturally, and that some of it's very very influenced by these people, but also is integrating different ideas or newer ideas as well. That's just the musical equivalent of that thought for sure. And so I thought, to have a young woman's voice open the album, like she's, I think she was 19 when we recorded it, and then to have an old legend's voice near the end of the album, and then that's just placing me as a songwriter kind of in the middle there, one link in like this chain of transmission or whatever, and that's something that's talked about elsewhere on the record. And Uwade, a friend of mine, had sent me a clip of her singing a Fleet Foxes song a couple years ago, and I was just like blown away by the character of her voice. And I was, as a singer, I feel like I try and use my voice in as many ways as I can, but you can't, I can't be her. I can't like borrow her voice box, or it was just feeling that her voice was perfectly suited to this song idea that I had for the intro. And it just felt like a nice kind of like destabilizing way to open an album, like with an unfamiliar element, and kind of open the door for more of that stuff in the future.
Beautiful.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at tapeop.com, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time.
Waiting inside a fire.
then maybe I can choose.